4 minutes after 10 is the time, and you know that something rather strange is happening, something notable is happening when Rupert Murdoch's Times newspaper dedicates a few paragraphs of editorial to the burgeoning popularity of the General Secretary of the RMT, Mick Lynch. Murdoch, of course, probably bears more personal responsibility than anybody in British history, except possibly Margaret Thatcher, for the denuding and the dilution of trade union power in this country. That's not an opinion, that's just counting, all right? You might think it's a bad thing that trade union power has been diluted, you might think it's a good thing, but I don't think there's much argument about who bears the most responsibility. But under the sort of headlines today is a genuine acid-tongued RMT leader wins fans as he takes the mick, reports the Times today. And that is a remarkable departure from business as usual, and it is obviously an enormous credit to the rhetorical skills and quite possibly the strength of the case being put forward by Mick Lynch. Now, I want to talk today about why anybody would be surprised by that, and I want to state from the start that I caught myself in that category this week, and I really shouldn't have done, because I was lucky enough to have a fairly huge aperitif, if you like, to that experience when I crossed swords on occasion with one of Mick Lynch's predecessors, the late Bob Crow, who was possessed of a similar rhetorical style, although a more combative one. What I find, I'm a student of this kind of thing. I find it absolutely fascinating. And Lynch's particular skill is to stay so calm. He's insouciant as he fillets people. It's quite incredible to see, and very, very rare, because, as this programme often demonstrates, the temptation to jump in, to cut people off, to interrupt, to huff and to puff even, the facial expressions you sometimes see on the television is almost irresistible. It has been suggested that if you have media training, then you are taught to expect an interruption. You see this with Tories. If you just let them carry on speaking, they don't know quite where to go. There was that little clip with Jonathan Gullis yesterday in which you could actually hear him gulp because he wasn't expecting to have quite so much road to run down. And obviously, if you're trying to do everything from memory, from a crib sheet that's been cobbled together by a 12-year-old working in Conservative Central Office, then even somebody as unself-aware as Jonathan Gullis is probably going to have a rabbit in the headlights moment when the person he's trying to pick a fight with doesn't interrupt and intervene. I'll play you some of the other examples of him taking some of the best paid broadcasters in the country, including, I think, the best paid broadcaster in the country, and bouncing them round the studio like a hacky sack. Do you remember hacky sacks? Yeah. And I caught myself being snobbish about it, and I really shouldn't have done. Because Bob Crow rinsed me on air. So I know what you're thinking. No one's ever rinsed you on air, James. No, Bob Crow did a couple of times. Right back in the day. I think the first time I crossed swords with Bob Crow was when I was here on Sufferance. There was this curious little interregnum just before some new owners, the last owners but one, the ones before the current owners, had just bought the station, and I was sort of just hanging around in the car park, metaphorically speaking, doing cover and holiday cover for any presenter who was away in the hope of mustering up enough money to pay a tax bill that had come in during a period of unexpected underemployment, but these details are dull. And Bob Crow came on. Now, I'm going to mention something that sounds boastful. I've probably mentioned it many times before when I was boasting, but on this occasion I'm not boasting. It's also a fairly pathetic boast, because if you're still boasting at 50 about things you did when you were 16, it rather suggests you haven't done much in the intervening period. So this is not boasting, this is context, okay? So I was a national public speaking champion at school, and I learnt a lot of the skills, or possibly developed a lot of the skills, that the rather brilliant Simon Cooper of the Financial Times has written about in a new book called Chums. And Chums traces Brexit back, would you believe, to the debating chamber of the Oxford Union in the 1980s, and it makes a rather brilliant case for the sort of hollow brilliance of a Boris Johnson flourishing there, and people like Michael Gove and Daniel Hannan and Jacob Rees-Mogg also in attendance, all there. And it makes quite a good case for that rather unhappy environment or makes a rather unhappy case for that rather unrepresentative environment somehow creating Brexit, or at least creating the momentum that would eventually lead to Brexit. And it's a world I know, not literally the Oxford Union, but the world of public school debating. So when I first saw on a team sheet, a running order at LBC, when I hadn't even been here 5 minutes, Bob Crow, General Secretary of the RMT, and it would have been a tube strike, I think, at the time, I'm fairly confident that I would have very, very arrogantly thought that, despite being about 11 years old at the time, I would be able to bounce Bob Crow around the studio because he's some sort of horny-handed son of the soil, some sort of rude mechanical, as Shakespeare calls tradesmen in Midsummer Night's Dream. And I don't think of myself as a snob, but I'm fairly confident that no snob in history ever really thought of themselves as a snob, except the performative snobs who sort of boast about being snobs and turn it almost into a brand. We will talk about people other than Jacob Rees-Mogg today, I promise you, but there's another example of his shtick. And even now, even this week, I listened to and watched Mick Lynch bouncing people around the studio. A few of you have pointed out that hacky sacks don't actually bounce, which is a very valid 1980s-based point. Bouncing broadcasters, Richard Madeley, and politicians, Chris Philp and Jonathan Gullis, Piers Morgan as well, bouncing them around the studio for fun. And everybody is surprised. I'd like you to tell me why. So we'll listen to some examples, and then I'd like you to tell me why. Now, one of the interviews I'm going to play you is not an example of Mick Lynch bouncing the broadcaster around the studio. I want to make that absolutely clear, because it's Nick Ferrari, who you've just heard on The Breakfast Show. Because when he interviewed Mick Lynch this morning, Lynch said something that actually forms the basis for this entire phone-in. It really resonated with my producer, actually. I was still on the tube. But when it was brought to my attention, it really resonated with me as well. And I want you to listen to that first before we possibly have a little look at some of the greatest hits of Mick Lynch this week. But the question we are going to ask is this. It's 2022. I hope that hasn't taken anybody by surprise. And we somehow inhabit a country that registers shock when a trade unionist turns out to be rather brilliant at debating or arguing his case. And that is mad. Just pause and think about that for a minute. I mean, the great names and faces of the Labour movement were superb orators. The last truly brilliant Labour speaker was probably Neil Kinnock. But the trade union background, the ability to hold not an Oxford Union debating chamber, but a shop floor of 1,000 people, the ability to communicate in that sort of context, that sort of environment, is something that society probably should have valued rather more than being able to quote Plautius in a tailcoat standing in front of a bunch of other privileged public schoolboys like me in a university debating chamber. But for some reason, between when? 1979 would be the obvious starting point, and 2022, we've become a country where Mick Lynch, by dint of being brilliant at arguing his case, becomes a sort of novelty value. He assumes a sort of level of interest that really shouldn't exist at all. So why? 0345 6060 973. Here's what he said to Nick earlier.
You mentioned the guards dispute. Mr. Shoveller shared with us that he started his career as a guard for British Rail, a former trade guard now in that position. Do you respect that? Does that make it easier for you to negotiate with Mr. Shoveller?
I've got total respect for Tim Shoveller. Me and Tim Shoveller used to work alongside each other on the railway at Eurostar.
What's gone wrong, Mick? Why are my boys fighting? What has gone wrong?
He's taken the path to become an executive in the railway, and good luck to him. Look, I'll say all of the people in this dispute mainly are very
my boys are fighting, and I don't like it.
Railway colleagues, but they're on different sides of the table. So we can deal with this. But the people that are dictating the terms, Nick, without being disrespectful, they've never done a hand's turn in engineering. They've not been out digging up the track. They've not been dealing with complex signalling systems, and they make these blithe statements about how the railway and very complex organisational structures has got to work. But they don't come from this background. It's all right going to Eton and studying classics at Oxford and whatever, and then telling the rest of the community and the rest of industry how it's got to work. But if they'd done some of this work on the tools out in British industry, round the clock working shifts like my members done, on very modest pay, most of them, they might have a bit more idea about how working people's lives are constructed.
It is 14 minutes after 10, and that's inarguable, isn't it? And yet, pretty much every broadcaster bar Nick has approached that interview, that man, for an interview, in the firm belief that they'd somehow be able to kneecap him. I know not everybody is surprised. The closer you are to the trade union movement, then perhaps the less surprised you are. But the question is pretty clear today. Why are so many people surprised that the General Secretary of the RMT can not just hold his own against some of the best paid broadcasters in the country and a succession of Conservative politicians, but bounce them around the room like a tennis ball? 0345 60 60973. And I will take anything you've got on this, even if you think it's obvious, because there'll be people listening who haven't thought of the thing or haven't clocked the thing that you think is obvious, quite possibly including me. It's 10:15. 10:17 is the time. I think Dan Walker, like Nick, conducted an interview with Mick Lynch that wasn't designed to show how brilliant the interviewer is. And trust me, I know how hypocritical that might sound. If there's going to be a union of smug presenters, then that's a job I'm qualified to be General Secretary of, but not every day, not every interview. But most of them have obviously approached it thinking that he was going to be a soft touch. And we'll start with Piers Morgan, who I think is probably the highest paid broadcaster in the country. And he had Mick Lynch on his GB News show a couple of nights ago.
If you don't want to be compared to the Hood, probably better not to have the Hood as your profile picture.
I think it's quite funny.
So do I. But I also like... As I was a Thunderbirds fan...
Is that the level we're at, though? Don't you want to talk about the issues rather than a little vinyl puppet from the 1960s?
I'm simply trying to get inside the mindset of the man about to wreak havoc on the country. It makes me laugh, honestly, that you have the Hood as your profile pic, because that's a man who wreaked havoc on the world.
Well, it makes me laugh that your level of journalism has descended so far that you can't think of any other question rather than a thing about the Thunderbirds.
I didn't put that picture on your profile page.
Yeah, but you've chosen to spend 2 or 3 minutes of this interview talking about an irrelevance.
And let's go with Richard Madeley as well, who has been doing this job for, more years than I think many of us have been alive. Why do people, let's say like me, so it doesn't sound as if I'm being even smugger than usual, why do people like me approach interviews with people like Mick Lynch thinking that it'll be a cakewalk, it'll be really easy? And although I haven't done that myself, I definitely did it with Bob Crow back in the day.
Are you or are you not a Marxist? Because if you are a Marxist, then you're into revolution and into bringing down capitalism. So are you or aren't you?
Richard, you do come up with the most remarkable twaddle sometimes, I've got to say.
I didn't say you were a Marxist. I'm saying that you're being accused of being a Marxist, and that's not twaddle. That's called reporting.
No, I'm not. I'm not a Marxist. I'm an elected official of the RMT. I'm a working-class bloke leading a trade union dispute about jobs, pay and conditions of service.
So what does this say about our society? I'll give you some examples of him dancing with politicians shortly. It doesn't go any better. Arguably, it goes even worse. It was honest Bob Jenrick's turn last night on ITV's Peston programme. But I'll get some calls up first. I think you understand the question I'm asking. I haven't quite articulated it perfectly yet. It's a question about why there is surprise about this, why there is complacency or smugness in people like me when we approach an interview with somebody like him, and what it says about society in general, or what it says about the history of our country over the last 40 years. And lest anybody think that I'm a fully... I do apologise. Apparently I said that interview took place on GB News. It took place on a channel called Talk TV. My apologies. The point being, of course, that it says something about everything. And I want to know what you think that is. 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. Brad's on the Isle of Wight. Brad, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Basically, I think that we have become so used to being lied to, lots of deception, that someone coming out and speaking honestly.
But because not everybody agrees with it. So that it's. I mean, everybody thinks they're honest with the exception probably of the current cabinet. But Keir Starmer speaks honestly. Angela Rayner speaks honestly. Most of us speak honestly.
I don't think they particularly go to the point, though, quite so easily and cut off unnecessary questioning as well as he does.
Why are we surprised that he can do it? Why are we surprised that a 16-year-old school leaver can do it?
I think we are surprised because we've been conditioned for so long of, the same old rhetoric of rubbish, essentially, the same lies, the same deception, and I think someone just being open and honest.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be quite a high bar today. I'm going to be a stern taskmaster. I mean, simply saying because he's brilliant doesn't address the heart of the question that I'm asking. I'm looking for something societal, something that runs deeper. Gary Burton, a pal of mine who I mentioned a few times on the programme, works as a painter and decorator and brought that disgusting story in the Mail on Sunday to my attention the other day, the one that was attacking people in the construction industry for talking about their feelings. He says, because we've been convinced that accent and background is a reflection of experience, knowledge and intelligence. I think that has got to be a large part of it. One of the oddest things I've ever done in an interview, if I talk about being rinsed by Bob Crow, was interviewing Jacob Rees-Mogg a few years ago, and people coming away thinking that Jacob Rees-Mogg had got the better of me about Brexit, which if you read a transcript of the interview would be impossible to conclude. But if you come at it from a deferential position, from the view that accent and background... Remember, I went to public school. I could talk posh if I'd decided at the age of 10 to start becoming a Lord Snooty tribute act. But there are thousands, if not millions of people in this country that think if you talk posh, then you must have experience, knowledge and intelligence. So Gary's answer is clearly bang on the money, but there must be more to it than that. John's in Maidenhead. John, what do you reckon?
Morning. Just listening to the last guy, it distilled a little bit for me. I don't think he's playing the same game.
No.
I think it's just that simple. He's playing a game of, this is my life, this is what I've done for decades, I know this inside and out, and I'm going to let you say whatever you want to say because you're going to play the politics game.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to wait, and then I'm going to hit you with the actual fact. The comment to... I think it was Chris Philp about how there weren't negotiations even scheduled for that day.
Yes.
There's no maybe. You can't spin that. You can't play. You can't mess around with that. He's in charge of the negotiations, and they weren't even arranged for the day.
Yes. So he's not. So this actually speaks to the broadcasting industry, not just to the broadcasters that he's got the better of this week.
Well, that's why he's doing it to all of them.
Yeah, because you can't let things stand. You shouldn't let things stand. It's this idea of balance or false equivalence. The presenter should just pile in and say, actually, the facts are. It doesn't matter what your opinion is. That's at odds with the facts. So when he starts saying you're lying, you're a liar, which I think was to Chris Philp, wasn't it? I mean,
it was.
The presenter really should intervene at that point and let the viewer or the listener know whether or not Chris Philp is lying.
And the presenter struggled because I think that they didn't really. It was a bit like if you take any sports game and somebody, you're playing football and someone picks up the ball and starts running with it, the ref wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the presenter was like. The presenter stood there flabbergasted that this person is just saying nothing but he's a liar and they're correct.
What was his name? William Webb Ellis, wasn't it? The one who picked up the ball and started running with it at rugby school when they were supposed to be playing association football.
I've no idea. But
it cost my parents a fortune, this education, mate, so I've got to show it off whenever I get the chance, John.
Well, I mean, you've got to pay them back somehow.
Exactly.
But one thing I wanted to make as a side point. So yes. My missus is a comms director in PR.
Right.
And I made her sit and watch the clip, and I was trying to ask her from her professional opinion, what does she think is going on? And she said, I couldn't brief someone to be that good.
No, I think you're absolutely right. My wife does some work in a similar field, and she would probably say the same. You can improve, you can polish, you can't create.
He knows his brief inside and out. He knows the detail. He knows it's his land, and they're visiting. And when they decide to go over here and have a look in this little bit of a field to dig up for something, he knows what was there 10 years ago because he's already been there. He's waiting for them.
But it shouldn't be rare, should it? Really, what you describe?
No, but that's because the people that get chosen to go in front of the broadcasters often start as a specialist or an engineer or a software developer or something in their trade, and then they get turned into a comms version of that. and they get told to play this game that they don't know how to play, that people like you, who were taken to silly schools and paid for lots of money and were taught to play this game from 5 years old, you were told this is what a quill is for.
7 years old. 7 years old. I was at the convent in Kidderminster when I was 5, all right?
But ultimately, you know where I'm coming from. You were taught how to play the game, and then you could apply it to any subject.
Yes.
They're taught how to do the subject, then they're asked to play this other silly game.
I think you're very close to the heart of it. I really do. And I mentioned Simon Cooper's brilliant book Chums. I do write about this myself, given as John has decided to bring my biographical details to the table. I write about some of this myself in my last book, How Not to Be Wrong: The Art of Changing Your Mind, which essentially says the skills that I have and had. I'll tell you what it is in a nutshell. It's about being able to win an argument without being right. The skills you need to win an argument without being right are not the skills that Mick Lynch brings to the table when he's up against people like Chris Philp, the Conservative MP, in one of the exchanges that have brought him a sort of form of what you would have to describe reluctantly as celebrity. Well, let's just say a level of admiration that is very rare to see. So here he is on Newsnight with Chris Philp a couple of nights ago.
Well, I mean, Mick Lynch has previously said he would not negotiate with the Tory government. The head of the, you've said that. The head of the. Let me finish the point. Hang on, let me finish the point. The head of the rail delivery group this morning on the Today programme said that he didn't want the government in the negotiation. We've made money available to the railway industry. It's up to the employers to negotiate with the trade unions. And what happened this afternoon was halfway through these negotiations, while they were ongoing, the unions came out onto the street and gave an impromptu press conference. I mean, there's TV
Direct
footage.
lie.
That is what I think you should be doing. I think more people, I wish we'd seen some of that during the Brexit debate, for example. And speaking of the Brexit debate, lest anybody think I've become a fully paid up member of the Mick Lynch fan club, RMT advised its members to vote for Brexit. And as far as I'm aware, he is in the group of people who are yet to realise or admit the sheer scale of their error in doing that. So I'm delighted that there is a rather large fly in the ointment of my admiration for the way he's been conducting himself. Chris Philp, there you heard, the MP for Croydon South, describes himself on Twitter as a father, serial entrepreneur and MP. Serial liar, perhaps, might be closer to the mark if Mick Lynch's analysis was correct. And it was. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. Let's squeeze in John in Nottingham. John, what would you like to say? What's going on here?
First-time caller,
welcome.
Long-time listener.
Thank you, John.
I think a lot of his success is the fact that he didn't go to Eton or Ampleforth, but that he, grew up like most people do, that he started working in his industry early and has had years and years of developing his skill, both in that industry and as a communicator with people. And I think a lot of trade union leaders are like that. They develop their skill through representing members, hard grassroots work.
Yes.
And that's why he's so good.
But in a way, using my Ampleforth Debating Society skills, picking up on what you've just said, we're talking about why he stands out, and yet your analysis introduces the notion that lots of union leaders are like this. I mean, they're not, are they? They're not quite like this. Otherwise, we would be talking about them every time there's a strike.
I think lots of them are like that, are very successful. And the most successful ones are the ones that have got the experience of the work.
Yeah.
They're not bureaucrats. I'm not a fan of union bureaucrats, really.
No, cool. And how hard is it? Because the longer you're a union leader, the further away from the graft you move, don't you?
Absolutely. It's like, I was a head teacher. Okay. And the further you move away from the classroom, the less in touch you are with teaching.
You became a trade unionist after teaching, did you? You went into the union?
No, I was a trade unionist as a teacher.
Right.
And, was involved throughout my teaching career.
But if you were to step up to an office, you'd have to leave the teaching behind, which is,
Well, strangely enough, there are some what would be called in union lay officers who do the job and do get to a senior level. So I was president of the NUT whilst still teaching.
Okay. Could you have been general secretary while still teaching?
No.
No, that's the part of the point, I guess. I'm intrigued by it. And how much of it is class?
How much of it is class?
In terms of people being surprised by how good he is, people like me thinking when I saw Bob Crow on the schedule 20 years ago, thinking, I'll teach this fella a lesson. God,
I often hear you talk about the fact that you think your education put you in a privileged position.
Absolutely.
Sometimes I think that's not correct, that I feel privileged that I didn't go to that kind of
it's a fair
advantage.
point.
Because then you are your peers at school are people drawn from all sorts of different backgrounds. Whereas if you're at Ampleforth, they're not generally, I would have said, and certainly not at Eton.
No, I mean, I'm not going to launch a socio-economic analysis of the kind of kids I went to school with, or the ones that were on scholarships or bursaries, or whose parents couldn't really afford to send them there. You're obviously right. The diversity is not going to be anything like it is in different schools. I suppose I talk about privilege in the context of being conscious of the fact that a lot of the things in my life that I value may not have been within my reach if I hadn't gone to a school like that. That's certainly why Mum and Dad sent me there. But it's quite a personal hobby horse that I appreciate not everybody finds as interesting as I do. Although I do really recommend Simon Cooper's book Chums for a look at the bigger picture, which doesn't reference me at all. John, thank you. It's 10:32. Apologies for the slight lateness of Holly Harris's headlines. 10:35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Why the surprise? So class part of it, possibly not all of it. Something about the nature of engagement. I guess if you're not doing it for a living, then you don't get caught up in the tactics of it. And this, I think, applies to everyone. So think about Question Time, the television programme, which he's on tonight. And I've got to tell you, for the first time in God knows how long, I might actually stay up and watch it just to see how he performs in that sort of environment, because I think we all play the same game around the Question Time table. I think even if there's someone there who, it's a large part of the reason why I don't do it is because you might end up with someone who you truly find dangerous or repellent on the panel, and by being there with someone dangerous and repellent, you almost validate or vindicate their presence at the table. You know, people whose views really have no place in public discourse or polite discourse. In this country, if you're white and posh, you can be pretty much a white supremacist and get a book deal and a seat on Question Time. Farage was never off it, was he? At one point, and we all play the same game, or you don't play at all. You sort of take your ball home. What will Mick Lynch be like on? I'll be really interested to see it, and I'm fairly confident the government won't be putting up any heavy hitters. I don't know who's on it tonight, but if there's a cabinet minister on it, I'll give you the money myself. And whichever poor junior minister or non-cabinet level minister they put on, I'd be very interested to see how it unfolds. So that's not obvious, the deference of it, in terms of why we're so surprised. No one's actually mentioned attitudes to trade unions yet. So I'll just leave that hanging rather than tell you what my thoughts are on it, because you've already heard plenty of my thoughts. But something about, because he is a trade union leader, we expect ... rather than simply because he is not posh or because he is, not Oxbridge or whatever it may be, as he said himself, because he didn't do classics or go to Eton. 10:38 is the time. Margaret's in Enfield. Margaret, what do you think?
Yeah, and I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, really.
First time for everything, Margaret.
Yeah, I think what he's brought to the table is a real freshness of being clear about what the issues are. He reminds me of, one of another great leaders from the RMT was Bob Crow.
Yes.
He talks it straight. He tells it straight. He's got his members back. He knows that he's only got a short window of time when he's being interviewed by the media or wherever it is. So he has to get the message across to the public, because that's his audience. It's not the media. It's not all of the, deflecting and whatever else. It's about getting across to the public what it is that he's wanting to achieve on behalf of his members, because he's been there, he's seen it, and he's wearing the T-shirt. And that's what trade unionism is all about.
But that applies to all. That applies to all trades unionists, and it's interesting that you reach for the for Bob Crow, a former RMT leader, because we should be able to name 10 performers from the trade union movement who are as adept and as effective. If your analysis is 100% correct, but I thought you might say that they just don't get that moment in the spotlight unless they take industrial action on this sort of scale.
Absolutely, and because they, in the trade union movement, the trade union leaders, general secretaries and representatives are seen sometimes as being like piranhas. We're the ones that are going to bring the country down. We're going to have a revolution. Mm-hmm. That's not what we are about. We're about equality. We're about diversity. We're about making sure that the workers, working people, not working class people, but working people, and people put it in a class, are getting their rightful earning of pay, retention, respect, accountability, and that's what the trade union movement is all about.
Why?
And we don't get deflected by all of this, they're this and they're going to bring us down and they're affiliated to the labour movement. Of course we are, because we have to be able to be the voice for the people that don't have a voice.
Why are, I'm going to say people like me, but it's people like me, it's not on this occasion me. Why are people like me so surprised by his performance? Why are broadcasters coming at him with a combination of really stupid questions or a really smug presumption that they'll be able to turn him inside out?
Because it's about this kind of hierarchy. It's about the kind of status that people see trade unionists and this, and how they see themselves in terms of the business world, in terms of the commerce. And James, you need to probably reflect on your own kind of
for sure
conscious bias in terms of about what trade union representative is and what they're about. And I think he's just shown that we are about the people, we are about the arguments, we are about the common person, and giving them the equality of opportunity, and that includes their pay. I think it's been absolutely refreshing. I'm fully behind the RMT and their cause. And
you're a trade union rep yourself, I suspect. Do you think that this little bit of love, or at least admiration, that Mick Lynch is securing on a personal level will translate into support for the union or the industrial action, or both?
I think people will understand it. I think people are frustrated. We've been in lockdown for over 2 years. I think people understand that there is an economic crisis, but they also understand that people deserve to be paid what they're worth, just like we've seen with the nurses, doctors and everyone else. So I do think there will be a lot more sympathy about what the trade union movement is trying to do and achieve for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, we shall see. I might do that tomorrow. I might do that tomorrow as a topic, actually, whether or not, or on the next strike day. Well, it's Saturday, I won't be here. But whether or not Mick Lynch knocking these people around like he's shelling peas will have an impact upon support for industrial action, and indeed whether it should. Margaret, thank you. Leah is in Southwark. Leah, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
This is very exciting.
For me as well, thank you.
Well, my thought is just that I feel like people have a very fixed idea of what intelligence means. Yes. I've been, a bit of a side note, I've been listening to a sort of deconstruction of the bell curve recently, which asserted that IQ is a fixed figure, and it very much is not. It's influenced by a whole bunch of things. Intelligence is really contextual, and it's flexible, and I'm intelligent in a way that my brother would not be, but then he's intelligent in a way that I'm not. And I think when people have such a fixed idea of what intelligence means, and it so often is tied to things like being upper middle class, and what university you went to and what kind of degree you did, and when you have someone who is from a working class background, who is a good orator and a good debater and is capable of thinking quickly on their feet and responding to talking points eloquently and intelligently, and not falling for when journalists try to run rings around them, it sort of flies in people's faces, and I think that throws them off, and that's, I think, where the surprise comes from.
I love the earlier caller mentioning, rugby, when I think his name was William Webb Ellis. I should have checked, but it was at rugby school, and they're all playing football, like with a round ball, association football, and William Webb Ellis invented rugby by picking it up and running with it. There is a sense that everybody else is playing on the same pitch, and occasionally someone comes along who isn't. What about the broader question that I'm trying to nudge people towards of what it says about our national attitude to trade unions, which has changed. When I was growing up, Bill Morris, I think, at the TGWU, and then they all got these nicknames like Red Robbo, and Arthur Scargill became a hugely divisive figure. So divisive, in fact, that there's 2 pages dedicated to him in the Daily Mail today, written by that fella, that working from home enemy who files from Florida every other day. What does it say about the national attitude to trade unions? Do you think? You don't have to answer that. It's not what you rang in to say. Jimmy Reed is another one, I think.
My own perspective of having engaged with being a member of a union, in my last job, I was bullied absolutely horrendously by my manager.
Right.
I was not in a union. I was working at an educational institution, but I was not a member of teaching staff.
Right.
Our staff handbook said that teaching staff could be a member of the NUS. The
NUT.
The Union of Colleges and Universities. I can't remember what the name
Don't
of it
worry,
is now.
fine. Yeah.
They were told they could be a member of that, but support staff were told that we had to make use of the staff rep system. And then when it came time for me to raise a formal complaint against my manager, I very quickly discovered that the staff reps did not have anywhere near the kind of power of a union rep. They did not have the ability to stand by me.
We just don't understand. We don't understand the dynamic anymore because no one ever tells us. In fact, they're constantly telling us that these people are our enemies and that they're trying to undermine us rather than help us and support us.
I was so disgusted by the time I left. I fortunately left in at the end of 2019, and I've got a job now where I am very well supported. But I'm still a member of a union just to be on the safe side.
Yeah, well, that's the whole point, isn't it? They're safety nets in a way, and I guess that's something that has been because reflecting on why I was such an idiot when I was approaching my first encounter with Bob Crow. I think part of it must have been osmosis. It must have been a sort of subconscious, not just a snobbery, but. 69, I think, he bought The Sun, a sort of Murdoch-inspired demonisation of trade unions throughout my entire life, man and boy, everywhere you turn. Almost all the coverage you read about trade unions or encounter about trade unions has been negative. And therefore, when you get a trade union leader on what we're supposed to call them barons, trade union barons, which is incredible, really, for cap doffers to be held in such low regard by their groomers that they think, well, let's call them a baron. They're actually comfortable with real barons, perfectly comfortable with real aristocrats or people who've been born with epic privilege and silver spoons up their nose. But let's call a trade union leader a baron, and then the plebs will take against him, because that's not how God ordered our estate. You're supposed to be born in this condition. You're not allowed to be a baron if you left school at 16 to train to be an electrician. So let's call trade union leaders barons, and then we'll be able to persuade the plebs that the union leaders are against their interests, because the only people who we should really be calling barons are the people whose ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. 10:50 is the time. I suppose one mystery has been solved this week. I think we did it as a phone-in on Monday or Tuesday. Why on earth have Grant Shapps or Boris Johnson not even met with the leader of the RMT, Mick Lynch? Well, I don't think you would either, would you? If you'd seen the way he dispatches people without even breaking stride. Here he is last night, a new one to add to the collection of Mick Lynch's greatest hits, with Honest Bob Jenrick on ITV's Peston programme.
There are two issues here, aren't there? One is the modernisation programme and its merits or otherwise. I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but from what I've heard, it feels like the unions are opposing a degree of that modernisation and the railways desperately need it.
But you don't know that, do you? You haven't examined our position.
Well, I do know a few things.
You haven't discussed
one, for example...
I mean, the Transport Minister could discuss that with us if you wanted to.
If I could just finish for a second. You've lost 20% of the passengers on the railway since COVID.
I haven't lost them.
That's not the fault of you and the
industrial change.
But we need to encourage those people.
The trains all through that period.
We need to encourage those people back. The worst way in which you can do that is by alienating your customers, by going on strike and making their lives much more difficult.
The worst way you could do it is insist that the fares go up by RPI, ripping off the commuters, but you won't give the workers RPI. The fares go up by RPI every year, the retail price index. That's the government regulations. Last year, profits were made by the train operators. £500 million out of that subsidy you gave went to those companies. First Group and Go Ahead, who we're negotiating with, are both subject to takeovers from private equity companies. They're going to be worth billions because they know that you're going to keep siphoning money from the public purse into private sector operators, just as you're doing in health,
what's
education
actually happened in the
care.
last 2 years is, in effect, a large swathe of the rails have been nationalised. So the idea that this is siphoning profits to the private
First
sector
Group made
ridiculous.
£100 million profit.
It is that thing that I think we're on it, aren't we? We called it right at the top. It's that skill set that gets you through so many situations. This is actually quite a lot of what my last book was about, because it works. It's a really valuable skill set. It can propel you all the way to Downing Street, this skill set. Being able to talk your way out of a tight corner, being able to talk your way out of trouble, being able to talk your way around any situation, throw in a plummy accent and a few Greek quotes or a few Latin quotes, and you are. It's almost like a superpower in our society. But cold, confident, fact-based, evidence-based, knowledge-based responses are like kryptonite to that skill set. But don't underestimate the strength of the skill set. This is one of the things I find hardest to explain, having tried to get rid of that skill set, to move away from that kind of, what is it, almost that combination of being a performing SEAL and a gladiatorial combat. It's a really valuable skill set in our society. It's essentially what we were taught in order to go out and run the empire in the public schools of Britain. But it's fascinating to see what happens when it comes up against someone like Mick Lynch. More on the broader question of trade unions if you fancy it. 0345 606 0973. No problem at all if you don't. Kay's in Brent. Kay, what would you like to say?
I think on the point of why everyone's surprised, I think it's because we're not used to seeing leaders. And he's a leader.
Yeah.
He doesn't have anything to prove. He doesn't have a game to play. He has a clear vision. He doesn't need to get emotional and shout because he's got nothing to prove. He's got the facts. He knows his subject inside and out. So he can wait while they dance their dance.
Yeah, and he does.
You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean.
And then he waits for the pause, and then he gives them the fact. And, you know, I watched Peston last night, and I laughed. I mean, honest Bob, bless him.
They're just not expecting. And to be fair to honest Bob Jenrick, he did say, I'm not an expert, but, which is a rare admission of reality by these people and a rare display of what might almost pass for modesty. And I mean that genuinely. It'd be better perhaps for everybody if more people said that. Or indeed, if a producer on that programme sat there and thought, hang on a minute, why have we booked someone who's literally stating that he's not an expert on this subject? Answer, because we always do. We always have to.
The presenters aren't used to it.
No,
MPs
we are not.
Just
to be clear, this is a problem that we all suffer from, not just the programmes we're picking out.
It's an authentic sort of set of power skills that he has, as in, you know, leadership, clarity, vision. I know I'm going to say the F word, facts.
Yeah. And
them all.
And this was the thing, going back to when I used to interview Bob Crow, this was the thing that perhaps I missed, and that you're describing, this authenticity, is built upon certainty. And that's why they're not on strike every week. When they're on strike with a huge mandate, a much bigger mandate than any politician in this country has ever won, I think.
Exactly.
When they're on strike, they are not. There's no self-doubt, let alone doubt. They are not under any illusions at all about the rectitude and the righteousness of their cause, because they are doing it with the most enormous democratic mandate. And of course, as you say, an understanding of exactly what the issues are.
Yeah, and he's up against people who have been given a script with nothing behind that script.
Yeah, which is what we saw with Jonathan Gullis, isn't it? When he was literally reading the script and stopping to gulp halfway through, because just for a nanosecond he could see himself as others see him, and he found himself as ridiculous as the rest of us do. There's a moment in that Jenrick thing as well. I didn't stay up for it, but you'll have noticed this. Someone's suggesting that the reason why he came back and said, Lynch came back and said what RPI stands for. He said Retail Price Index. And my correspondent here says the look on Jenrick's face proved he didn't know what he was talking about. So he said Retail Price Index back instead of RPI. I disagree. I think when Lynch brought up the Retail Price Index being linked to rail fares, while the wages of railway workers are not, Robert Jenrick's face showed that he knew he had just been destroyed. You had that little moment, that flicker of recognition that I think everyone who ever appears on television having an argument lives in constant dread of. You've just been completely rinsed. But given the debating styles and what we're talking about, you remarshal your forces and you come back determined to pretend that you haven't. But there's no way back from an observation like that.
There is no way back. And I think a lot of the look in Bob Jenrick's eyes was actually, you know, the bunny in the headlights look.
I do.
It's kind of, okay, I don't know which way to go now, because that's not in my script. So, you know, it's like a telesales person. They've got a script to follow, and if you interrupt them, they lose their place.
Beautifully put. And in fact, just to illustrate that point made so well by Kay, let's listen to the Jonathan Gullis clip, which is literally, well, not literally, obviously, but it's literally a beautiful illustration of what happens when a telesalesperson who is reading from a script gets put in their place. And listen out, I'm not sure how much of this clip we've got, because it's not necessarily exactly the same as yesterday, so it may not contain the gulp. But just listen out for the gulp in case it does contain the gulp.
The pay rise that Mick wants will therefore just add more cost to the rail network, making it more unaffordable for more working people. He should be apologising to the doctors and nurses who can't get to hospital, the patients who can't get their operation, the kids who will miss out on their education today, but also those armed forces veterans who risk their lives for our freedoms, who won't be able to celebrate Armed Forces Day on Saturday.
Do you want to apologise for all that, Mick?
Well, I think Jonathan should apologise for talking nonsense. None of that is true. We have got automated technology on trains. We've got pantograph cameras, we've got ultrasonic sensors, we've got things that detect faults on tracks. That is all rubbish. I negotiated that deal with Network Rail myself. We've got on-train technicians, all sorts of new technology that is being deployed. So that is just stuff that's written in Conservative Central Office for backbench MPs to spout along with their ministers.
Mick. Okay, so no sorry to
I
veterans.
don't want this disruption.
Fine.
I don't want people to be
good to know veterans
inconvenienced, and I want a settlement to this dispute. I can't do that with a backbench MP who's just learnt it off a script.
Well, hang on. Let him respond to that.
And that backbench MP who's just learned it off a script actually boasts in interviews about having based his teaching style on Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is heartbreaking on so many levels, not least for the poor children that were taught by him. Boasts about it, basing his character, if you like, or his false personality, his inauthentic character as a teacher on Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, which is the most beautiful illustration of what happens when people from a humbler background fall for precisely the sort of deference and forelock tugging that Mick Lynch appears to be a powerful antidote to. We will return to some of this stuff, no doubt, in the coming days. And given what usually happens on this show when I unveil my admiration for somebody, keep a close eye on Mick Lynch, because he's probably about to come a cropper. And yes, he does still support Brexit, so yeah. It is 4 minutes after 11, and I'd forgotten what we were going to talk about next until that story about the cricket just popped up in the news, reminding us of the institutional racism that Azim Rafiq faced. Breathtaking, really, in both its scope and its depth and its normalisation, including a really fascinating area of racism for those of us imbued, whether we realise it or not, with oodles of white privilege, in that thinking that because your brown-skinned mate went along with it, he couldn't possibly have been hurt or upset because he went along with it. What you learn if you open your ears and your eyes and you actually pay attention to other people's lived experiences is that an awful lot of people of colour have no choice but to go along with it. And how many times a day do you pick a fight with your colleagues or people who are, to all intents and purposes, your friends? You call them out for being offensive or for doing stuff that they don't find even remotely remarkable. You'd die of exhaustion by Tuesday, wouldn't you? If every single time you encountered a sort of microaggression or a mild example of institutional racism from someone who you otherwise like, number one, you probably wouldn't stay friends for very long because nobody likes to be pulled up on their behaviour. And number two, you'd have little time left to play cricket or indeed do anything else. So I was drawn today to a story that I think in a slightly saner universe would probably have garnered more attention. And the headline is pretty self-explanatory. Race and religious hate offences recorded by police hit a new high in 2021. This is a record that dates back to 2013. So records only began in 2013. That's a fascinating little window. Those of us of an obscenely centrist disposition like to reference the 2012 Olympic opening ceremony as a sort of embodiment of our values or our dewy-eyed, somewhat sentimental notions of patriotism. Do you know there was a bloke, I can't even remember his name, I think he was the MP for Sutton Coldfield, his name might have been Aidan something. My memory's a weird place, as you know. And he complained on Twitter about that opening ceremony, which I think was I think he subsequently got into trouble because he went on a stag weekend with someone dressed as a Nazi or something like that. It's so hard to keep track, isn't it? There's so much of it out there. But that was quite an early indication of the so-called culture wars, which wasn't even a phrase that had been coined at the time. There's a Tory MP I think one with a glittering future ahead of him, one marked for a glittering future ahead of him, who carked it all by essentially, I think, complaining about too much diversity in that opening ceremony of the Olympics in 2012. So in many ways, he was ahead of the curve. If he'd managed to keep his counsel for a few years, he'd probably be in the cabinet now, instead of, I think, ending his career, his political career. 6 minutes after 11 is the time. So that's why I find the date interesting. We started measuring in 2013. And in 2021, the figure was the highest ever. I mean, it's gone up every year, actually, since 2013. I'd love to have seen what the numbers would have been like if they'd been measured from, say, 1997 to 2012, or from 1997 to 2010, whether or not we would have seen a decline. I have the suspicion, but it's not evidence-based or factual, that I think there was a general perception that racism was in retreat throughout all the years where political correctness had become a catchphrase, that we were becoming clearer and clearer about what we couldn't say in public and what we couldn't say to others, even if you were still thinking toxic thoughts in the back of your mind, or even in the front of your mind. Everyone who complained about political correctness was increasingly conscious of the fact that they couldn't say those toxic thoughts out loud. They couldn't give voice to their belief that you know, people with different coloured skin were dodgy or inferior or something like that. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. And I don't have the numbers, but from 2013 to 2021, you have a fairly steady increase, with a bigger increase than usual, kicking in between 2020 and 2021. I'm just going to ask you why you think it is, because some of the reasons given up by the researchers are, to me at least, surprising. But then again, I obviously have no lived experience in this field. None whatsoever. So I think in the first instance, possibly not for the entire... His name was Aidan Burley. He was the MP for Cannock Chase. Gus in Colchester says, I went to school with him. He was an idiot then too. I knew he was called Aidan, not Sutton Coldfield. My apologies to the good people, the good burghers of Sutton Coldfield. Cannock Chase is just up the road. He's the fellow, I think, that complained about the Olympic opening ceremony and what turned out to be a very telling precursor of the so-called culture wars. But back in 2012, it could end your political career, or it could draw so much attention to you that when they found a Nazi skeleton in your closet, that could end your political career. Now, that would get him in the cabinet. I'm not being glib. I honestly think that would be grounds. What would have got you a whole heap of trouble in 2012 for essentially, I think, complaining about certainly complaining about elements of the Olympic opening ceremony, which was a very, very big celebration of diversity, that would get you a seat in the cabinet now. Back then, it brought so much heat to you that the media started going through your bins and found evidence of... I'm fairly sure it was a bloke he went on a stag weekend with someone dressed as a Nazi. Would that end a career now? Would it, heckers like? Honestly. Could you imagine that? Anyway, 9 minutes after 11 is the time. So some of the things they've given up as reasons why racious, there's a word that should have been invented before today, racially and religiously aggravated offences recorded by police in England and Wales hit a fresh high in 2021. Now, listen to these two examples. With reaction to England's defeat at the Euro Football Championships likely to have contributed to the increase, new analysis shows, and the easing of COVID-19 restrictions being another factor named by police forces as having led to the rise in offences. Now, there is obviously also an improved recording of hate crimes. That's not something that you're going to be able to explain, I don't think, through lived experience. And we can derive, if not comfort, then some succour, I think, from the thought that part of the reason behind this increase will be an improvement in how things are registered and recorded. It's not a completely infallible reflection of our society. It's not a completely infallible reflection of society. If you count, it's a bit like Donald Trump's approach to coronavirus. If you stop doing testing, the number of cases will come down. So the more accurate the picture you want, the more testing you do. But if you're not interested in accuracy, you're just interested in whatever's best for you, then you stop testing people and you claim that there isn't any. If there weren't any COVID tests at all, there wouldn't be any recorded cases of COVID. So that's rather good, isn't it? That's a perfect example of the relationship between the quality of measuring, the quality of recording, and the statistical reflection of reality. So that is, it's a mild comfort, I think. Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is? Why do you think 2021 saw the highest number of racially and religiously aggravated offences recorded by police in England and Wales since records began in 2013? Hit the numbers now and you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in, I'm not prejudging this conversation, by the way. You're perfectly entitled to ring me and talk from different perspectives. But I do, in other words, when I say, I wonder whether you, as someone a little bit older, perhaps, have noted a decline in decency and a rise in racism over that period from, say, 2012, 2013, or 2010, perhaps, to 2021. How you measure it, how you've noticed people saying things to you that they might have said in the 80s, but they wouldn't have said in the 90s or indeed the noughties. I don't know. I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth, but I do want to know why you think this increase has occurred. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. The football saw a huge outbreak of racism on social media, of course. The attack upon the 3 black lads who missed their penalties was astonishing, but I think that was stoked by government, for what it's worth. I think that the way that some politicians essentially defended the quotes, fans, end quotes, who were booing England players who took the knee in protest against institutional and historical racism, the way that some politicians and commentators essentially, let's not beat about the bush. If you're defending people who are booing footballers taking the knee, you are telling racists that they're all right. And it doesn't matter what colour you are, what job you're doing, or what background you come from. You're essentially saying to racists, oh, that's fine. Because if you're booing an anti-racist programme or an anti-racist gesture, there's only one reason why you would be doing that. I think a lot of us, possibly not me, but a lot of people were slightly guilty of treading on eggshells at the time because you don't like to call people racist. But if you're booing an anti-racist gesture, you're doing it because you don't like anti-racist gestures. And there's only one reason why you wouldn't like anti-racist gestures, and that's because you're a racist. You can disapprove of it, or you can think it's not a brilliant idea without being a racist. But if you're actually booing it, so when you find a black football player who says, well, I won't be doing it, I don't like it, doesn't mean he's a racist, and his existence doesn't let everybody else off the hook for being racist. Actually booing it means you're a racist. So when people like Priti Patel came out and defended their right to boo or be racist, as is more accurate a description of it, it created an environment in which many people felt empowered, if not encouraged, by cabinet-level politicians to come out and attack these black lads who missed the penalties, which, you know, is a racially or religiously aggravated offence. Some of the stuff you saw was absolutely gross. So why? What do you attribute it to? There's not going to be one answer to this. I imagine there are going to be several. I'm a little bit confused in a sharp rise following the easing of COVID-19 restrictions. It's almost as if like racists got constipated because they couldn't get their racism out while they were under lockdown. Oh, I can't go out and be racist. This is awful. The lockdown doesn't... I can shout abuse at the television, but it's just not the same as shouting abuse at an actual person. But that doesn't make any sense to me. Could it be anti-Chinese racism? Some of the rhetoric, again, that was encouraged by people who do know better. I used to say people who should know better. They do know better. It's their brand. It's their shtick. The anti-Chinese rhetoric that came out of some corners of the media and the political establishment, did that mean that you, as a British person with Chinese heritage, that you found yourself facing the sort of racial abuse you'd never encountered before? I'm just filling in a gap there, because I can't imagine why the easing of COVID restrictions, there was a low vaccine take-up, it was reported, among ethnic minorities. Would that have caused racist attacks from people who, I guess, a slightly nuanced form of racism, that, because you're really cross with someone because people haven't taken the vaccine, but it was reported correctly that people from ethnic minority backgrounds were less likely to take the vaccine for a whole heap of reasons. I don't know whether that's true. I'm just wondering why there would be an increase in the incidence of racially or religiously aggravated offences after the lifting of COVID-19 restrictions. Obviously, part of it will be that the number of incidents during lockdown were unprecedentedly low, so there was bound to be an increase when you came out once restrictions were lifted. But why would it be so much bigger than 2019 and 2018 and 2017? And again, I stress, lest anyone wastes a couple of minutes ringing in to tell me that part of the reason for the statistical increase will be an improvement in recording, and as one police officer puts it, the success of encouraging members of our communities to have the trust and confidence to report hate crime. But I'm interested in the why of it, and I'm really interested in what you have noticed. People, and it might be for other white people listening to this programme, it might be that you've noticed it in other white people around you, possibly your own family members. Your racist Uncle Bob, who did actually wind his neck in for a while, but then, with his little Nigel Farage badge, he's decided he is allowed to be racist around the Christmas table again. It could be that. You've got people rewarded with high-profile media careers after complaining about people speaking foreign on trains. So why shouldn't your racist Uncle Bob start complaining about people speaking foreign on trains? Unlike Farage, he's probably not such a hypocrite that he's actually got foreign-speaking children at home. So in many ways, he's a more authentic racist than Farage. But I don't want to blame it all on him. Although I suspect he bears a lot of responsibility for this, as do the people that kept promoting him and propelling him into the spotlight. But I want your answers, and I want your evidence, I want your stories. Fascinated by both the lived experience of being on the receiving end of it, but also those of us who perhaps are guilty of witnessing it and not calling it out. I can be accused of many things. I don't think I can be accused of that, but you never know whether or not you sit there and say nothing when somebody says something that 20 years ago would have had you coughing up your coffee. 0345 60 60973 is the number that you need. And don't forget, it's Thursday. This is what Mystery Hour is invented for. It's Thursday. There are by-elections unfolding today, which is why we can't talk about politics. And that means that Mystery Hour will be on the way at 12. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Race and religious hate offences recorded by police hit a new high in 2021. Improved recording aside, why? Nicola's in Milton Keynes. Nicola, what do you reckon?
I reckon one of the reasons is that I'm a black woman, that a lot of people that I know, other black people, are fed up. Since George Floyd and a lot of other things that have happened in the public eye, perhaps with Meghan Markle as well, they've realised that anti-racism doesn't seem to have worked in the past, and the tendency to keep quiet about these incidents. Like you said, if you kept saying things in the past, you'd be exhausted.
Yes.
The amount of times you get these microaggressions. But now we've decided we've got the strength, we're going to be exhausted, and we're going to make a fuss, and we're going to say something. We've just had enough. So I think that might contribute to it.
I hope so. I mean, because that's quite a positive answer to quite a negative question, isn't it? It's not a pleasant conversation to talk about a rise in religious and race of hate offences, but of course the key word here is recorded. I mean, it is more people coming forward. Why though? I mean, because having had enough is only part of it. Having confidence that something will be done interests me. Has that increased?
Not necessarily,
No.
but I think, again, most of the people I know, having confidence that something will be done isn't really part of it. It's something in us. We're saying to ourselves, we can't keep saying it's okay. We're saying to our kids that it's okay to let it go, which is, I'm also a little bit angry because, just a little bit off piece here. When Prince Harry said about how his dad said it was, this is how it is, and basically you just have to live with it. This is kind of what our parents did. My grandparents came over in the Windrush era and all of that, and they just sucked it up and got on with earning a living. And sometimes we've said to our parents, why didn't you say anything to us? They didn't explain the detail of how bad it was. I knew after my grandmother died how bad it was for her when she came over from St. Vincent. And so we don't want our kids to have to deal with that. And we're starting to talk and speak directly to them and speak out on our own behalf in front of them, just to teach them. That's a large part of it for me and my friends. We don't want it to be perpetuated.
If you just sit tight and keep your head down, things will get better. And then in the last few years, particularly the last 2 years, you mentioned the George Floyd case, the realisation the penny has dropped that actually they're not. They won't. It won't get better. We need to get out there and demand improvement.
Yeah, they terrified my mother with the Windrush thing because she came over. She's got her paperwork. Her parents are good and they kept it, but she got approached and she was absolutely terrified.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah,
that's your reward. That's your reward for sort of keeping your head down and going with the flow, is that you could get deported illegally. Wow.
Yeah, so
I mean, I don't know what the next chapter is in that story, because it would have to see people somehow seeing valid responses to their complaints and actually seeing visible change. I don't know if we're at that stage yet.
I don't know. A lot of people I know are just leaving. But, yeah.
Is that right? They've just had enough?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah,
Well,
back to Africa, back to the Caribbean. Yeah.
Thank God there's not a massive labour shortage in this country, Nicola, because that would be really bad news then, wouldn't it? And it's not even linked to, it's not even directly linked to Brexit, that one, is it?
No.
24 minutes after 11. I hope you're staying. I got these record-breaking listening figures. I think that's the main reason why I don't want anybody emigrating anytime soon. Anthony's in Colne in Lancashire. Anthony, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. Long time listener, first time caller, and just a bit nervous, really.
It's only me, Anthony. You've got nothing to worry about. Go on.
Oh, I've been a season ticket holder for quite some time, and I've noticed since supporters have been allowed back into stadiums, especially around where I sit, I have seen a personal increase of racial hatred directed on the pitch and towards fellow supporters who sit in the stands.
And more so than before lockdown?
Yeah.
So something changed a bit then during lockdown?
Yeah, I believe.
You're talking about the football when you say a season ticket holder. I don't think you need to tell us what club you follow, because I don't want you getting gypped next time you go to a game when the season starts again. But it's a local club, presumably, up in Lancashire.
It is, yeah. And as you saw, the nearest team to me, Burnley, they made the press for all the wrong reasons with the White Lives Matter banner.
Yes, of course.
That flew over.
Yes, God, I'd forgotten about that. And this must be linked to the taking the knee during the Euros, mustn't it? It must have been a sense that when the Home Secretary comes out on essentially on the side of the booers, people are thinking, because Priti Patel is a brown lady, there's a brown lady saying it's all right for us to boo an anti-racism gesture. That's an astonishing fillip to racists. It's incredible, actually.
It is. It's pandering to the racists. It's like giving them a free pass, saying, "Oh, it's okay." The Home Secretary says it's okay. We've got a free pass.
And how? I mean, what are we talking about? They're shouting the N-word, or
targeting ethnicities, race, their sexual orientation.
That's still, that wouldn't be racially or religiously, but it's all part of the same picture, isn't it? So just this, something shifted a bit during lockdown that let people think that things they wouldn't have said previously are now acceptable. And I think do you ever do anything about it? You can't really, can you?
Well,
and also, I don't know what club you support, but there are almost certainly ethnic minority players on your team sheet every Saturday, aren't there?
Yeah, there is. And there's a scheme that the club do. It's like, see it, report it, basically send a text message anonymously with the seat number to the row and where you're sitting, and they'll act upon it. But getting a mobile phone signal inside the ground to send a text message, it's impossible.
Yeah, of course it is.
And figuring out what their seat number is without physically going up and looking and checking, and
what do they expect to happen? I mean, that is probably gesture politics, which is, of course, the phrase that Priti Patel chose to use to describe people actually taking the knee or supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. I'd forgotten about that, but it must have translated to football fans. The people being invited to ring into radio stations to defend the booing. I think there was one who turned out to be a white supremacist anyway. So, you have, in a way, invited these people back into the public space. And how can they not think that their views are acceptable if they're being invited to share them in the public space all the time? Thank you, Anthony. It was a sparkling debut. I look forward to your next contribution. I wonder if probably your club's a bit bigger than mine, so I doubt that we'll be in the same ground next season at all, unless you support a National League North side. 28 minutes after 11 is the time. Leslie's in Keith in Scotland. Leslie, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James. Yes, just phoning to say that I was in London last year with my husband and my 12-year-old daughter, and we had a double whammy of racism and homophobia. We were watching Wicked in a theatre in London.
Yeah, great show.
Behind it, Oh, it's amazing. And behind us, there was this gay couple, a couple of guys, and we got chatted into them, and they were saying where they were from. Now one of them had a darker coloured skin,
Right.
and then we learned that the other one was originally from Glasgow.
Yeah.
So we were chatting away. And then they leaned over and said to us, "Oh, the couple that are sitting next to us, they're being really awful. They're being really racist. They're being really homophobic. They're shouting comments."
Really?
So when I looked at the couple that were sitting directly next to them, it was a guy and a lassie, probably about in their 30s, 40s,
Yeah.
and they were swigging from bottles of wine.
Oh,
Not
classy.
even from a glass, swigging
No.
from bottles. Yeah, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say their first names because it's absolutely hilarious. It was Wayne and Cheryl.